Hi, everyone. I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of our favorites is this online lecture series. So we're very pleased to have you joining us today to learn more about what do you know about marketing metrics. Before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather those questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. And one of the questions we always get is, will this be available after the webinar? And yes, this will be recorded and archived on our website, and you'll receive a follow-up email with links to that and perhaps some other resources. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our three authors today. I will be very brief because frankly, we could take the entire time just giving you their background and credits. Dave Reibstein is the Woodstock Professor of Marketing and past at the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania. He is the past chair of the AMA Board of Directors, a former executive director at MSI, and is widely published and has won numerous awards, as have his colleagues. Paul Farris is emeritus landmark professor of landmark communications professor at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. He is a former academic trustee of MSI and again very involved with us over the years. And Neil Bendle is associate professor of marketing at the Terry College of Business, University of Georgia. And he brings an interesting perspective on the topic today, having been formerly director of finance for the Labour Party in the UK. So seeing as how this is our last broadcast of the year, our holiday edition, we're very happy to have our three wise men today with us to talk about marketing metrics.
Nice transition, Earl. We appreciate that. So I will add my own thanks to all of you for attending. Of course, our not so subtle purpose here is to sell the fourth edition of the Marketing Metrics book, which is in very small print down below the title. The way we intend on trying to sell you that is to not portray it as a great Christmas gift or Hanukkah. We'll talk a little bit about the content, the organization, and why we think even sophisticated marketers can benefit from having a desk reference like the one we've written. So just so that you can get a fixed image of us, there's another picture, which I think is the next slide, showing the and I'll hesitate here. Okay, there it goes. You know, of course, I'm the one in the middle with the gray hair, and you can see I've augmented that with a COVID due today. Since we have live video, I don't think we need any more of that. But Dave and Neil, do you want to say something a little bit more about yourself and your perspective on metrics before we transition to the next slide?
Actually, the only thing that I will add, and Earl mentioned that I had at one time served as the executive director of the Marketing and Science Institute. And when I was the executive director, we always have the research priorities that MSI issues. And what rose to the top of the list of all research priorities was the whole issue of marketing metrics. And it actually is what it is that sort of converted me to start spending more of my research time on what should we be measuring? How do we put together dashboards? How do we understand these terms? How do we connect it to financial consequences? But it was because of MSI and the member companies listing this as one of the prime, actually the prime research priority, that it helped shape the research that I do. And there's been a whole list of others that have also joined in pursuing this. And I'm delighted to be part of this team that's put together this book that we'll be talking about. But I will also join Paul in thanking all of you for joining us today.
Well, I certainly echo that, and I really appreciate so many people being here to hear us. And you know, I've enjoyed so much working with Paul and Dave and Phil, who we'll talk about later, over the years on this project and these books. It's been very exciting. my background is, I come from accounting. So one of the things that I certainly bring is sort of a feeling that, we need to know how to talk to people who aren't marketers. And so that's always in the back of my mind when I talk about these things. Why are these things useful? Who cares? Who should care about them? So you'll see that coming through in a lot of what we talk about.
So just a quick word about the missing picture here is Phil Pfeiffer, the key person, fourth author of our book, and Phil is truly retired. So, I'm only about 80% retired. We couldn't persuade him to be here, but three's enough, maybe even a crowd. So we get one of the first things I think I'd like to add to what Dave and Neil have said is that it's easy to think about marketing metrics as something that you could just sort of look up. What's the formula? What's the definition of this term? And that would be enough to go forward. We think it's much more complex than that. As Phil Pfeiffer said many times, we who wrote this book, and now I've written it 4 times and have gone through it many more times, we still refer to it on a fairly regular basis when we need to understand the subtleties and deeper aspects about many metrics. One of the questions we get is, why are there so many metrics? Well, one of the reasons is the situations that call for a particular metric are quite different. And some metrics are particularly appropriate for and very valuable in some situations, and others they have very little to contribute. And even in the situations when they're most relevant, there's strengths and weaknesses that everyone needs to understand who is going to be a serious user of those metrics. Businesses evolve, and even if you started out in one situation with one set of competitors, environment, those are all likely to change. Metrics that are most useful over the lifespan of a company may also change. Next, the number of marketing metrics increases every day. New sources of data, different marketing tactics, different technologies are forcing us all to almost stay on the treadwheel of staying abreast of what is current. And although it'd be tempting to think that some things become irrelevant, they may indeed become only less relevant, and we find it increasingly difficult to kick anything out of the book. So the number just grows. Finally, it's often that we see some summary metrics like customer lifetime value or marketing return on investments or forecasts from simulated test markets as kind of the thing that you need to rely on in a given situation. What is less recognized is that all of those summary metrics rest on a whole host of other metrics that you need to calculate and really understand how useful the summary metrics can be. So it's a good transition, David, to you on this topic.
Yeah, so let me pick up on exactly that. And it's the issue that while there are a whole bunch of metrics, most of those metrics are interconnected with other measures that exist. And so what it is that we're trying to display in this one particular slide is if you're interested in customer lifetime value, recognize that that is a metric. It certainly has become much more popular in the last decade, maybe a little bit longer, but that rests upon a series of other what we call constituent metrics. So customer lifetime value is clearly dependent on margin per period and the retention rate and the discount rate. Some of you may even have different ways of trying to construct customer lifetime value, but it is different metrics that feed into sort of the master metric that we're looking at here. So one of the questions that we received before we even started today, so some questions were sent to us in advance, and one of them was, well, what about the interrelationship between metrics? And the answer is absolutely. And throughout the book, what it is that we do is we try and show what these relationships are. And once you have some of these measures, then what do we sort of compare those to, and how do they relate to some other measures? So for example, customer lifetime value is one that, you say, okay, here's what the value is. Is it worth it for me to acquire customers? Recognizing that differs across individuals. So what's the cost of acquisition? And we can also look at various different prospects and make some assessment as to whether or not we should go through the effort of actually acquiring them. So we've got a whole series of those. We've got a structure of how we look at it. What we have on this slide is sort of the organization of the book. And what you can see once we get past the introduction and the overview, we have some, sort of what we call share of hearts, minds, and markets. Those are going to be, softer measures in some way. Also, looking at the next chapter, you see we try and connect it with financial measures as well. So looking at how these marketing measures have an impact on some of the financials of the firm. And you can sort of see the rest of the ones that we have and the organization of the book. I want to particularly point out the last two items in the bottom right-hand column there, the marketing metrics, X-ray, and testing. Some of what it is we're talking about there is trying to look at what dashboards people have, how these sort of fit together, how you can look at it in various different ways and get a bigger picture of what it is that's going on for the firm. And recognize that almost all of these metrics, and it relates to what I was showing in the previous slide, how all of these metrics interrelate to each other. And so to get a true picture of what's going on for the firm, you need to have a system of metrics, which is also why we refer to dashboards as well.
So yeah, I'm going to weigh in with one additional point there, if I may, Dave. Is in the notion of system of metrics, we take care to distinguish between definitional relationships. So if you were to look at something like the DuPont model that takes return on investment and unrolls that into the definitional financial components, marketing has the equivalent of that. One of which Dave sort of illustrated earlier with customer lifetime value. But we also have systems of empirical relationships that are not definitional, that are more like response functions that are measured in the market. Combining those, differentiating those, we think is a very important aspect of creating systems of metrics. And that's one of the things that this book, I think, spends more time on than almost any other source that I know of. Yeah.
And so I'll take it from there. What we did, before I do anything, I'll just say thanks to Diane for saying that she appreciates what MSI have done, bring us here. I'd like to thank MSI as well. Give a bit of history. So this starts back in the mid noughties or whatever we're still calling them, 2005-ish, when we're working on this book, and the first edition of Marketing Metrics came out. And we called it 50 plus metrics every marketer, every executive should master. And honestly, we were having a little bit of a joke there with the 50 plus in the idea of, we weren't actually formally counting it. But there was clearly, there was a ton of metrics in there. There was kind of well over 50. It was hard to know exactly, how you count particular metrics, but we had them in there. Then we moved on to the second edition, and these were both really, really well received, and we were very pleased about what's happening. And in the second edition, we increased our treatment of sort of social media and some more sort of the internet and sort of changes in the world, as you can imagine, happening towards 2010. By 2015, you can see the covers are certainly getting a bit more exciting on the graphic design front. And in the third edition, we had a survey in there of marketing managers, which we took out because we wanted a bit more room. We put in some ideas about neuromarketing measures and other concepts. We fleshed out some of the things that we're talking about testing and how you use the metrics. And we're currently on the 4th edition, which has just come out a couple of months ago. It's all now very exciting on the graphic design front. And let me tell you what's new in that. Well, the first edition got everything going, but the 4th edition, we've added in a lot about sponsorship metrics and omni-channel metrics. And, you know, many of you will know sort of Paul's done huge amounts of work on omni-channel metrics. So he's got some other stuff you might want to consult on that. And one of the things that we were looking at, and we got a question earlier, is, you know, what metrics are good for sort of, you know, the more junior marketer or the marketer working, you know, on the particular data of a campaign compared to, you know, what a more senior CMO type marketer might want. So we try and sort of, in the book, we try and sort of emphasize, you know, which will be useful to who. And we put in a bit more about finance type metrics in this edition. You know, maybe we see you know, maybe there's been marketers with us since, you know, for 15 years now, 14, 15 years, are now, you know, growing up. Maybe our first generation of CMOs are coming in there now. So we have a bit more there about how you work with finance, and how we wanted to also share. There's been a lot of activity going on in respect of marketing accountability. So we were all involved in the Marketing Accountability Standards Board, MASB, which has done a lot of work in this area. So, you know, we wanted to share ideas of happening with that and with various ISO standards. So we've on brand valuation, brand evaluation. So we put a lot of that into the new edition there. So you get your sort of, you know, good idea of what's been happening in the world of marketing accountability over the last 14, 15 years.
So Neil, you said something which caused me to think of something else. Many years ago, John Quelch and I did some work for a couple of packaged goods companies where we looked at what assistant product managers did versus associate product managers versus more senior category managers and so forth. And what you were talking about there reminded me of something that we haven't done in the book, but, you know, certainly might think about, which is to, you know, which of these metrics are more appropriate for an entry-level marketing trainee, someone doing kind of the, you know, the spreadsheets of that they typically get assigned versus the things that more senior CMOs or later tend to be more responsible for. So I think it's a good point we might kick around in the question and answer session a little bit later.
And who knows, maybe there'll be a 5th edition. So if anyone's got any great ideas.
So part of what it is you just heard is Paul is the one that always has the whip on this project, and he's already starting to think about the 5th edition of this, but I'm sort of just enjoying that we have the 4th. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the structure of each section, but then I want to give you a little bit of foreshadowing here. We're going to stop talking about the book after this slide, and we're going to do what professors do. We're going to give you a quiz. We're going to ask you about particular measures and not just talk about what the book is, but to see if you are still alert and if you know your marketing, if you know your marketing metrics. But let me talk about how each of these chapters are structured. And what many people have told us is they're using the book actually as a textbook, not as a reference. Also using it to help guide a lot of decision-making that they're doing. Because we go into not just giving the definitions, but to take it a little bit further and talk about what are the purpose of some of these measures and how can one try and utilize it. And I'm going to try and go through that and talk about a particular example of cannibalization rate, which is defined in the book. And so we talk about the construction of it. So you'll see in each chapter for each of the metrics, we go through the construction. What are the equation? What are some specific examples? So if we're going to talk about cannibalization rate, you would look at the sales that are lost from an existing product as divided by the sales of the new product. So what percent of the sales of the new product came from your existing products? And we talk about how that could be measured in units and how it could be measured in dollars. So you can have two different types of cannibalization rates. We spend some time in each chapter talking about the data sources. What are the complications, caveats that there might be, things that one needs to be cautious about. So just to be really clear, when we talk about cannibalization, sales that you have are your sales, and you cannot cannibalize somebody else's sales. Yes, you can still share from them, but that's not what would be considered cannibalization in the traditional sense. One of the questions that we're often asked is there some universal cannibalization rate that one could expect? And the answer is, of course not. And whether or not you want to have a cannibalization rate in part depends on what the margins are. And so it's not bad to be cannibalizing if you have a higher margin that's there. But also, you need to expect that the market is going to be dynamic. There's going to be things that change over time. And maybe you want to do some of the cannibalization. Better to cannibalize yourself than wait for somebody else to come in and do the cannibalization. There are some related metrics, and we talk about that in each of the chapters. So, for example, another measure is a fair share draw. And that means I introduce a product. If it is a fair share draw, it draws equally from all the existing products in the market. Or is it attracting customers and volume disproportionately for your product versus some of the others? And some of the reasons why that might be the case. But in general, again, there are other related metrics like the incremental sales. But enough of us talking to you. It's now time for us to put our professorial hats on. And Paul, do you want to get us started in thinking about the quiz?
Absolutely. Okay. So we're going to build this. So the question that I'm going to ask you is represented on the next slide. Yep. Okay. Let's hold it right there. So here's the question: the relationship between customer lifetime value and retention rate. And what would you think about higher versus lower retention rates as far as the reliability of customer lifetime value estimates? And I want to pause and just emphasize that we know we don't measure customer lifetime value. We project that into the future based upon some current measurements and the calculations and extrapolations. So would you feel more or less comfortable about the reliability of those projections, that customer lifetime value projection, with a high retention rate, say, 95%, versus a low retention rate, say 25%?
And so what I'm going to ask you to do is in the chat, and some of you have already started doing that, put either true or just a T or an F, and we're going to see what your answers are. And
Paul, I should have rephrased that.
Just to give you a sense of it, almost everybody is saying true.
I'm excited that we have some disagreeing.
Almost everyone.
I don't want to highlight them too much, but I believe they're co-authors and they're having a fight on a chat, which I think is great.
Well, good. Then let's kind of look to our next our table and so forth. Sort of, if you will, advance the slide so that we get the next bit of information here. We'll tell you why we think it is likely false. We don't expect you to all roll over, but true that we think it's true that high retention rates are better than low retention rates, of course. But if we think about the reliability of the customer lifetime value estimates, then one way to maybe look at that, at least this is the way that Phil Pfeiffer and I decided to look at it, is to look at the percent of the projected customer lifetime value that would be received in 5 years versus retention rates. And you can see that the lower the retention rate, the higher the percentage of that projected customer lifetime value that you're going to receive in 5 years. Once you get around 90% retention rates, that falls to 50%. It means that only 50% of the customer lifetime value would be received in 5 years. So our view of this is that anything after 5 years is really risky as far as technology, as far as competitors, regulations, consumer taste, that projections much further than 4 or 5 years get kind of shaky. So from that perspective, our argument would be the higher the retention rate, the more you might have to be careful about taking those customer lifetime value estimates at face value.
Paul, as a professor, you've got to set 10% discount rate because, that's the rate you always throw into every question. What if someone wanted to know about that?
Well, then it goes in the other direction. The lower the discount rate, you might think, okay, the higher the customer lifetime value. Absolutely. But that means that you are not discounting those values out in the future, so that it is the lower discount rates are probably going to be riskier from a change in the market conditions perspective. And we've got a nice table in the book. I believe it's page 178. That sort of lays out this trade-off between retention rates, discount rates, and the percent of customer lifetime value that would be received in near periods.
Well, let me take over then. Let me ask you another question. So this is an illustration of a sort of more definitional type question. And clearly, one of the things we were trying to do was bring together some sort of agreement on what terminology means. There's a lot of terminology out there. Like we wanted to sort of give some idea. And at this point, I should really give a shout out as well to Paul's work with MASB on the Common Language Dictionary. If you're not aware of the Common Language Dictionary, you should look at that. But yeah, this question sort of talks to different terms and what do they mean. So 3 common media terms, reach metrics, opportunities to see, exposures, impressions. Which of the below do you think are true? Opportunities to see are the least valuable, exposures are next, impressions are the most valuable. A relative impact of the 3 depends upon the media in question. That feels like a bit of a cop-out answer, but feel free to answer it. Impressions are the only one of the 3 metrics that reflect changes in perceptions or attitudes, or they're about the same, and they're simply terms to quantify estimated audience size. So let's see what's going on in the chat as I speak. We've got a lot of D's, some non-D's, but mostly D's. Let's see, and I will come back. So yes, so we
give them a second. They're still coming in.
Yeah.
I see. Oh, there's an A.
But most are going for D, I think, which is good. So we argue that the terms are basically used interchangeably by marketers. If they mean the same thing, and clearly they're going to have the same effect. So that's where we come to. I'm going to toss the talk over to Dave now.
And
Okay.
Dave is also a member of the MASB's dictionary.
Great.
And David Uball's in there too, right?
I am indeed.
You're doing a great job. John Gasky too. You're doing a great job.
Okay, so in terms of audience quality, you're doing okay. You did a little bit better on that last one than the first one. So we're going to throw another one at you here. And beg pardon?
Have you got a measure of audience quality?
Actually, we should have a measure of audience quality in there too. We'll add it in the next edition of the book. Yeah. This one's about price elasticity, a really common term that we see. And the question is, if you have reliable measures of a product's elasticity, you don't need cost to set prices. Now, Neil has already moved us to the first part of that answer. There you go. And so the answer to that is true. If you don't care about profit. But if you care about profit, then that's false. And so let's look at the rest of the answer that we have here, because price elasticity and unit variable costs are essential for determining profit maximization. So indeed, it's really important to measure your price elasticity. I want to know how much the volume changes as a percent of how much your volume changes as a percent of the price changes that are there. And they're very, very useful for trying to figure out what's going to happen with your volume. But if you're interested in profit, you got to have the cost. Paul reminded me the other day that, hey, we often hear about cost plus pricing. Yes, that would, but that doesn't mean that cost plus pricing gets you to the optimal price. You need to know the percent of change, and you also need to be looking at the margins that are a result of that. But you definitely need to know the unit dollar cost and convert those into margins to come up with your overall optimal price that you've got. And by the way, a question just came up, which was, wait a minute, don't we really need, it was a legitimate question, which was, wait, when do we not care about profit? And the answer is we should care about profit. There are sometimes firms are only interested in, I'm trying to maximize my market share, or sometimes marketing and sales are very concerned on what they're measured on, which is often just the revenue. But ideally, we're more concerned about profit.
So our next little quiz is another kind of simple definition, and this is a term, sales velocity, that has come into use more frequently in our experience in the last few years. So which of these definitions, or which of these would you say is most likely to be true? In order to measure sales velocity, you need A, measures of sales and distribution, and where distribution is, we're talking about availability through resellers. Sales per week or month, sales per unit of time. Sales and shelf space, C. Or D, share of requirements of an individual.
Paul, this is Earl. Can I ask the audience to use the chat? Please use the chat function to respond to the quizzes. If you have a specific question that you need to type out, use the Q&A function. We'll try to keep those separate. It'll be easier to keep tabs on both. So when you vote, please use the chat function.
So Paul, just to give you an idea what the answers are that are rolling in, it is almost exclusively A and B, with a leaning towards, it looks like it's leaning towards B.
Interesting. Well, that sounds quite reasonable. I agree with you. And it may be that in some industries, sales velocity per unit of time is increasingly accepted. But the way that it is used in consumer goods marketing, especially by the Nielsen's of the world, the measure would be A, and you could argue that C is just as relevant as long as shelf space was measured in distribution units, such as all commodity volume or product category weighted volume. But it's that ratio of sales or market share to distribution that is the most current use of the term in, as I say, Nielsen and many of the market research providers in consumer marketing. And one of the reasons this is a key metric is it can help you as a marketer understand whether a product is in danger of being discontinued by distributors or resellers, or if it has a very high velocity, very high sales or share per unit of distribution, you might find that there's potential for expanding distribution and expanding sales through distribution. And since expanding distribution is one of the fastest and most reliable ways to increase sales in the short term, it's pretty important to understand whether those increases in sales are likely to be sustainable, or whether you're just going to waste a lot of money buying or getting additional distribution that won't be sustained. And velocity is a key measure for doing that.
So
Making that decision.
let's slip in another question about price elasticity, since we gave away the answer because of happy fingers.
You seem
on the last price elasticity.
they're just not very, good.
But this will be price elasticity Jeopardy 2. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at manufacturers' price elasticities. So the question is, reliable estimates of manufacturers' price elasticities are derived from short-term, that being weekly or monthly sales changes in retail prices, sales volume, and market share. Is this true or false? And boy, I'm watching the answers come in, and they are universally false so far. So far. I'm going to give a little bit more time because some of you are slow in trying to come up with this answer. Oh, Gary Lillian just gave it true. Let's see how much influence he has over the rest of the crowd. And that put a pause on other people sort of answering here. And Gary, I think you are an outlier. Oh, there came another one that just slipped in here as true for us. Nina Reynolds came in with the true, but the rest of you are almost universally false. Well, let's turn to the answer. So the answer is, this is likely false. In many retail stores, substantial short-term changes in price and sales are usually reflective of temporary promotions and price reductions. Changes in retail price can be lower than or greater than or equal to manufacturers' price differences on promotions, depending on the extent to which the manufacturer's discounts are actually passed along by the retailers. So increases in retail sales on promotion can come from non-promoting competing retailers or consumers stockpiling for future consumption. These promotion elasticities may bear little relationship to the effect of long-term changes in manufacturers' prices. For the latter, competitor reactions are also very, very important on this. And so I see Gary also shows that I only now about, he only knows about B2B, which is reflective there. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, well, let me, this is our last question. So if you've aced it so far, you've only got one more guess to do. So obviously ROI is really important. All of us to a certain extent have done work discussing this at various points. Is maximizing annual ROI, so marketing return on investment, one of the best goals for a marketing manager? True, false, or again, maybe? Maybe seems a bit fence sitting to me, but if you want to get maybe, that's fine. Maybe is almost certainly the answer to every question that you could possibly ask. So, but it feels a bit cheaty.
So again, we have a lot of false and maybe in there.
Okay. So what we're going to say, well, that's so we're going to say it's likely true if, and only if, the marketing budget is more or less fixed. So if you're planning to spend a certain amount, then just looking at ROI is great, really. However, maximizing ROI is not a guideline for setting budgets. Basically, diminishing returns means that additional spending will typically result in lower MROI. And that kind of makes logical sense if you think about it. You pick the best projects first, and so you do them. And then when you get down to the sort of more marginal projects, they're the ones with going to be lower ROIs if you've done your prediction correctly. In which case, should you do them? Well, yeah, some of them. I think someone was saying, you look at the the MPV coming in. you know, some of them are going to make money, and you know, if you can do them, that's great. But you know, they will probably reduce your overall MROI. There's obviously other strategic goals, and this can get a bit tricky as well. You know, encouraging trial, that sort of thing. And so when we talked about annual MROI, you know, anything annual can be challenging in a marketing context, because clearly, you know, one of the things I think we'd emphasize as marketers is you know, the long-term matters, and you know, anything just in a single period isn't really what you're trying to do. But obviously, things can kind of get a bit tricky. The longer you go, obviously, the harder it is to measure things generally. Anyhow, so that's the end of our quiz section.
But let's take questions. Let's take questions because we wanted to allocate some time for those questions. And you know, one of the questions, I'm going to direct this one to Paul that I saw, and then Earl, I'm going to let you start picking out questions you think we need to answer. But the first one I'm going to direct to Paul, which is a question that we got, which was, how do these metrics differ if we're talking about services versus if we're talking about physical products?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it just reminds me of the difficulty of spelling out the 10, the 12, the 15, the 20, you know, most important metrics. And it is so reliant upon the type of business, the stage of the product life cycle, and competitors that you're facing, and so on. Now, back to the question. I think in general, services depend upon ongoing relationships with customers that are more likely to be direct relationships between the firm and their customers. They're less likely to work through distributors or resellers than selling products are. So things like customer lifetime value and CRM systems are probably more important for services than for physical products. I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but if we're looking for some generalizations, that would be the first one that comes to my mind.
But in general, I would think that most of the measures are fairly universal across settings. Would you agree?
Well, as I said, except to the extent that services deal direct with and not through resellers and retailers and distributors, you know, then there's, that's the top thing that comes to my mind. Yeah.
Okay. Earl, do you have questions that you want to sort of vet for us?
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's great. First of all, thanks to all three of you. I think that was a lively discussion and really got into the complexity and nuances in choosing metrics and why you need multiple metrics. But a couple of the questions related to kind of the general trend in these use of and development of metrics. And I'm going to combine a couple of items. Gary Lillian asked a question about, used to hear a lot about dashboards, maybe less so now. What seems to be the evolution there? And Bob Leone had a related question about what has changed in terms of what senior executives care about. So you guys have been doing this long enough, as you indicated, to have some sense of those trends. What is emerging as perhaps more important today, less important than in the past? How is that changing some of the dashboards and other forms of reporting? And let me insert one other related sub-question, which is, when it comes to reporting, do you see this as something that the financial person in the organization should make the reporting? Should it come from the CMO, or someone actually asked if it should come from the chief knowledge officer? That was not a plant, but apparently someone else had the idea that that person could be the reporter. So what are the trends? What's more important today? And who should be doing this reporting to the senior execs that ultimately have to approve marketing budgets and so forth?
So I'm going to jump in and take the first part of that, so that allows me to take the easy part of the question, and then I'm
there. You go. Go for it.
My co-authors to deal with some of the other part. I mean, part of it, by the way, is really easy to answer, which is why I wanted to jump in first. When we first started this, there were very few sort of social media sort of metrics. That clearly has changed over the 20 years or however long it's been that we've been doing this. And so more and more, We see all this, down to the number of shares and the number of likes are things that are often being reported, and people count as very, very important on that. So that's an easy one for us to talk about. I do want to be sure and address part of what it is that Gary Lillian asked in terms of, we heard so much about dashboards 10 years ago, and we don't nearly as much now. And I think we were hearing about it 10 years ago because it was sort of the beginning. Actually, we had heard first about scorecards, and then it sort of, evolved to talking about dashboards. And I don't think dashboards have gone away at all. I think they've just become more commonplace. And one of the questions is, so what metrics do we need to have on our dashboards? One of the things that we've been very concerned about is, in the book, there's more than 130 measures. You don't want all 130 on your dashboard. And so one of the critical questions is, which one should you have? I'm working on a project right now where trying to see, do I have a different dashboard when I'm making pricing decisions than when I'm making advertising decisions or when I'm working on new product development? And so it may be that there are some dashboards that are idiosyncratic to the decisions that I'm making. Certainly, Gary, I would have different dashboards on the B2B side of the business versus B2C. And so there's still, dashboards are still around every bit as much as previously. It is that it's just not as new, so there's less new talk about it. Paul, Neil, do you want to take the other part of the question?
I would add it's not just different kinds of businesses, it's even within the same organization. If you think about the kinds of things that the sales force is responsible for in lots of marketing organizations, they have a completely different set of metrics that hopefully roll up to some of the same things, but those are different than the marketing communications person, someone working in social media or on the pull side of the business. So I would agree with Dave. I don't think dashboards have gone away. I think they've gotten more sophisticated, more detailed, they're updated more rapidly, and they're even differentiated by, where in the organization of people sit. I do think it's, go ahead.
I was just saying that, and they're more organic than they used to be, meaning, they are live. The time interval in which they're being updated has gotten a lot shorter.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. I can remember trying to put some dashboards together about 20 years ago and trying to get them to live update, and it was fun. I would say as well, who actually owns this? I think it's a challenge letting CFOs do this sort of thing, to be honest. And I talk, as an accountant, obviously not a practicing accountant at the moment. But one of the things we did was we chatted to a bunch of CFOs. And one of the things we kept on getting back was marketers can do whatever reporting they like as long as it's in GAAP. And that's a real challenge because, I don't think we've, as marketers, embraced this idea that there's management accounts and financial accounts, and we need to, take more control out of the management accounts, the accounting that isn't controlled by GAAP. And I think a lot of management accounting at the moment is driven by GAAP, sort of US financial regulations. I think we've got to get management accounting away from that. And so we've got to start talking about measures that, are internal. So they're not about the stock market, but you can do pretty much what you want internally. You can put together whatever measures you think are helpful for you as a manager to run it. So I'm going to put in a little bit of plug for my website. So go to my website, neilbendle.com, and I've got a big section there on this idea I have of marketing accounts in the popular marketing metrics section. So I've got a ton of stuff there. Perhaps have a look at that. And one of the things I argue there from a paper that I did with Chin Wang is talking about how marketers have got to sort of own some of their data, but they've got to take it seriously as well. You know what I mean?
So Neil, is there an issue though when marketers start reporting numbers to the public, especially to the investment community? Now you may have one definition by what you mean by retention rate, but that may not correspond to, well, the general definition. And isn't there a kind of a corresponding need to be precise and transparent with how these metrics are defined and operationalized if they're going to be put out for the potential use of investors to begin to do their own analyses and decide whether this is a good buy or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if anything's being put out, you should be very careful about what's being put out, because you could end up like in jail and that sort of thing. But one of the things I'm keen to talk about is sort of internal metrics. I don't think that we've quite sort of got our message strong enough that gap should not be the thing that's driving your internal managerial reporting. Absolutely don't take whatever wacky idea you have and put it out to the investment community and then hope no one's going to get angry with you, because they will. But if you have an idea, you can actually do some of this internally. And one of the things that's exciting about that, I think, is you develop better measures over time as you consistently think about what measures you're doing internally. So I kind of think we as marketers have potential to take a little bit more control, but with control comes responsibility or something. I think you've got to be serious about it. You can't just come up with a number one month and then come up with a different number next month because it looks good. So I don't want to come across as someone who's advocating for anyone doing whatever they want at any time they want. But I think we need to kind of be clear that internal stuff is for internal decisions. External stuff is the thing that's getting to the shareholders, and you shouldn't be putting the internal stuff out to the external people.
So Earl, I think we have time maybe for one, maybe two questions, depending on how verbal we are. So go ahead.
So one.
I wasn't going to say it, but thanks, Dave. Yes. Let me, first of all, thanks all three of you. I think what that illustrates is some of the challenge around this. If this was easy, we would have done this a long time ago. So that's the important point here. I do have a couple of questions that Joanna Seddon put in. And by the way, she said she's using the book, finds it of great value working with her clients. And so again, shout out on that. But she's saying you're seeing a lot more these days with big data analytics around consumer sentiment and so forth. And I think in a somewhat related question she has as well is another buzzword these days.
Oh, we just lost you.
Yeah, I lost that.
Yeah.
Earl, you're muted too.
Yeah, I just dropped off for a moment. Sorry about that. So the idea of measuring sentiment, putting that in some kind of metric, and more broadly, relating this back to the notion of purpose. And Shubha Srinivasan also pointed to the recent, business roundtable discussion about other shareholders. So I guess broadly, the notion of purpose can stand in for that debate as well. So putting about the context, measuring sentiment and the broader context of other stakeholders, including things like the purpose-driven organization. Go for it.
Paul?
No, there's no way the three of you are speechless. Come on.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get Shubha to help write the 5th edition to address that part. I mean, I hear what you're saying. And to me, it is, we have been so focused, many would say still to this day, correctly so, on getting profits and the stock price and shareholder value writ large, that we have ignored, these other quite clear purposes, or at the very least, constraints that we should be paying attention to. And I know there are places like the new organizations that are measuring employee happiness and sentiment, and not only consumer sentiment. I don't have a good answer, so I'm not going to mumble around. anymore.
So what I will add on it is undoubtedly there are some things we're not yet measuring, and at least there are things that we're not talking about in the book. And so any suggestions that you have of things, we welcome. We're not letting Paul fully retire. He said he's 80% retired. We're holding on to that other 20% for the fifth edition, which apparently started today. And so as you have ideas, let us know. I saw in several of the questions that were submitted that there were other things that you were asking about that aren't in the book. And so there are things that we need to start trying to see if we can come up with good metrics for and make sure to capture. One of them I saw was, of course, around efficiency. And so there are things like that we need to try and capture. What I'd like to do right at this time is say, look under your chair, and taped to the bottom of your chair is a copy of the book. But Oprah did not lend her studio to us, so we are not able to do that. But instead, what we've been able to do is get you a discount for the book, so you can save 35% if you're interested in the book. It's obviously also available on Amazon. You can follow us and about the book and comments on marketing metrics. And then for each of us, we have various ways to try and link up with us. I've been running a radio show called Measured Thoughts, which really comes from this whole area of marketing metrics. So I now have converted it just to a website called measuredthoughts.com. Neil is there, as you can see, at neilbendle.com. Easier to spell than Reibstein. And Paul,
right, that was available when I tried to get it. There was no other sort of Neil Bendles that wanted neilbendle.com.
And Paul, last, how do we link with you?
Farris P at Virginia.edu, and that's a good way, So, and by the way, speaking of linking with me, because I was doing this on an iPad, I was unable to see kind of the comments in the chat room. So if there's anyone out there that particularly had a comment directed to me, I would more than welcome you to simply Google me and then email me if you can't remember Farris P at Virginia.
But thanks all of you, and thanks to MSI for sponsoring this webinar, and appreciate all of you joining us today. So good luck and good measuring.
That's great. Thanks to all three of you. Again, it was a very lively discussion, and as they all indicated, they would love to hear from you and follow up. That's one of the great things about MSI. It's not just a one-off event, the networking and connections. I do want to just remind the audience then that we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar after the event, and you will have links to that in the email, and there'll be other information that you can use to follow up. Again, since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. So thank you all for attending today. Happy holidays to you all. Stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the new year.
Thank you.